Hello, everyone, and welcome to our program, a webinar on North Carolina Historic Cemetery Preservation. My name is Taylor Wolford, and I am the Outreach Librarian at the Government and Heritage Library, which is a part of the State Library of North Carolina. This event today is hosted by the State Library of North Carolina's Government and Heritage Library. To learn more about the State Library of North Carolina and the services we offer, please check out our website. First, I'd like to provide some information about accessibility features for today's webinar. To view closed captioning, please use your mouse to hover over the control toolbar on the top or bottom of the screen and click on the closed caption or CC button. Second, select either show subtitle or view full transcript options. To make any changes to the caption or accessibility settings, click on the closed caption button and select subtitle settings. A new window will open. In the left pane, click on accessibility to make any changes that you would like. For today's webinar, I also encourage you to interact with us in the chat feature where you can submit questions or request assistance from GHL staff. If you navigate to the live transcript tab at the bottom of your screen, you can change the chat text size by clicking on subtitle settings to adjust the chat text size. Today's program will be recorded and made available online via the State Library of North Carolina YouTube channel. If you have a question during the event, please feel free to ask your question in the chat. We will have a Q&A portion today at the end of today's webinar. And if we are unable to answer your question at that time, we will follow up with you over email. Before I hand it over to Melissa today to begin today's presentation, I am excited to share that the State Library, Government Heritage Library, has a new research guide coming soon. So myself and my colleague in our reference team, Beth Hayden, have been working on a research guide. This guide will specifically assist researchers interested in exploring cemetery records in the state of North Carolina. In the meantime, there are already some digital tools you can start using today with a Government and Heritage Library card. A great online resource that I've shown here is the North Carolina Digital Collections, which is a collaborative project based out of the State Archives of North Carolina and the State Library of North Carolina. And I've included the link to this digital collection website there as well. And so on our digital collections website, you'll find cemetery survey records with transcriptions and documentation of gravestones from across the state, often including descendants' names, dates, and even familial relationships. Lastly, the Government and Heritage Library provides access to online resources and databases. This includes access to platforms like the Ancestry Library Edition, which can only be accessed in the GHL Reading Room at 109 East Jones Street. We also provide access to Heritage Quest and NC Live, which offers searchable death records, obituaries, and more. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's guest speaker, Melissa Timo. Thank you so much, Melissa, for being here today. Melissa works as a staff archaeologist and historic cemetery specialist for the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology, which is a part of the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Melissa manages the Office of State Archaeology's Historic Cemetery Program, which identifies, inventories, maps, describes, and permanently records existing cemeteries in North Carolina that meet the federal definition of historic. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will hand it over to Melissa to begin today's presentation. Thank you.
And I will share my screen. All right, thank you so much for having me today, and I'm so excited to be here. We're going to talk about the state registry that falls under my management and talk to you about what it is, why it's important to add your cemeteries to it, and some tips for recording your cemeteries. Cemetery recording is your first and easiest and most important step for historic preservation of our historic cemeteries. I estimate that there's between 100 and 250,000 cemeteries in the state of North Carolina, and most of them are very small family cemeteries that easily get lost over time, especially with the modern movement across the landscape. Very few people stay in their hometown these days, and so they're often the first ones that get lost. But I rely very heavily on folks to report them to me so that we can make sure that there is a permanent record of these cemeteries, so that we can mitigate any problems that might pop up. So like I said, what we're going to cover today is what is the Historic Cemetery Program, what is the Site File Registry, which is it's called the Site File, the registry that I was talking about, and the tips. So first, I am with the Office of State Archaeology. We generally look at all of the human history in North Carolina from coast to mountains. There are a number of different offices across the state. I am in the main office in Raleigh, just a couple floors down below the state library. We have offices for underwater archaeologists, we have conservators, and we have an office out in Asheville to help the mountain counties rather. So the Office of State Archaeology's Historic Cemetery Program has two purposes. One is to identify and record cemeteries, as was mentioned, but the bulk of my time is spent answering weird cemetery questions. Some of them are about how to take care of cemeteries. Some of them are about the laws surrounding cemeteries that protect cemeteries in North Carolina, or accessing cemeteries, to very unique circumstances that pop up with care, weird neighbors, all kinds of fun things like that we help people develop long-term management plans. I also like to share resources because a lot of people feel like they're doing this by themselves when there are so many people doing so many wonderful things all across the state, maybe even a mile down the road, that all you need is just that link and you can get ahead. I hate reinventing the wheel. And so we want to provide you with these resources that may include professionals, professional archaeologists, restorers, researchers, people who help do the more complicated cemetery tasks that are just beyond what regular people with no training have. But everything I'm going to talk about today are things that you can do yourselves without hiring anyone. But like I said, most of my goal is to ensure that people think about cemeteries and think about them in the long term. Cemeteries are often passion projects. It's really easy to get really worked up or excited about doing a cleanup, but if you don't think about a long-term plan, then in a year or 2 years or 6 months, it may be going back to what it started at, and then we've lost traction. So I'm going to help you develop plans in order to make sure that the cemetery is looking great and has a idea to respond to storms and vandalism and future burials or not future burials and all kinds of fun things like that. So I talk to people about that there are three main places that you should record your cemetery. Because like I said, recording the cemetery is the first and biggest thing to do for long-term cemetery management. Unfortunately, most of these different layers don't interact. Even though we all sometimes talk to each other, sometimes our systems don't automatically populate each other. So for right now, what you need to do is to go through each one in order to make sure that your cemetery is recorded in as many places as possible. Most cemeteries, especially family cemeteries in North Carolina, have no paper trail. There aren't laws necessarily requiring that a cemetery be added to a deed. Now, modern cemeteries have slightly different things, but those old historical ones operated on a principle that I call everybody knows. everybody knows where it is. Everybody knows that that family farm had a cemetery. However, over time, if the family moves away or they're all gone, then those people who know also start to fade away, and then we know nothing. And so the goal is to make sure that we develop a really robust paper trail. So no matter what happens, who's looking into developing the area, that somebody is aware that a cemetery is there. First, seems like rockets, that doesn't seem like rocket scientists, but make sure the cemetery is on the deed. This can be tricky because some counties will require that you bring on a land surveyor to do that type of work. But we can talk about things like buffers or what the best practices are for that if you get to that point. But following up with your county's register of deeds is a good first step. Next, some counties have a cemetery list themselves. Now, the list isn't always official or like for sometimes it is in something like the zoning and planning office where the GIS team lives, and they have a county map that says where the different cemeteries are. A lot more counties are starting to do that because of the effects. It makes it really hard to zone or tax or appraise a property if you don't know if that is a cemetery with 2 people in it or a cemetery with 200 people in it. But sometimes those cemetery lists for the county are kept in something like a genealogy society or a local library's public history room. Sometimes counties don't have anything at all. So double checking on the local level to see if there's something is your next step. Finally, it's adding it to the state registry, which is called the NC site file, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute. And so those are your 3 levels. The site file is a collection held by the Office of State Archaeology that contains archaeology sites, both pre-European contact and post-European contact. It contains some historic sites as well as historic cemeteries from across the state. As you can see on the picture on the screen on the right-hand side, that is what I see when I look at our maps. Now, these maps aren't publicly accessible for most people, and that's because there are confidentiality and privacy state and federal laws that because of some types of sites like native sites that we can't advertise this information. So if you have interest in learning about a site or to see if your cemetery is already recorded on our registry, right now you have to reach out to me, send me an email or a phone call, and I will check. But our list is not exhaustive. So all the things you see are the different sites that are recorded on the site file, but they are not all of the sites that exist in the state of North Carolina. There have been people living in what is now North Carolina for more than 10,000 years. And there, like I said, are hundreds of thousands of cemeteries. And the sites that you see on the screen are not all of those. Those are just ones where either archaeologists, historians, or citizen reporters have reported cemeteries. So you can see a lot of those long squiggly lines. Those are probably DOT projects. The clusters are in high development areas like urban areas, or they could be around cities that contain universities that have archaeology programs like the UNC system, East Carolina, App State, all have archaeologists and they do a lot of work in their local area. Also, a lot of these are from people who have reported sites to us, because anyone can report a site to us. And we have different types of forms to do so. It's fairly easy. You just fill out this little form. There are professional level forms that require a lot of extra data, especially about geological features and artifact types. And then we have what we have called sort of citizen scientist forms, the sort of more accessible forms for regular people to report information to us. So on the screen on the left-hand side, you see our citizen scientist archaeology form, but there is a separate citizen cemetery reporting form that we're going to talk about today. So why list with the state? Well, first, like I said, it's the first step for conservation and preservation. And this list is super useful to expand our knowledge on the types of cemeteries that we have across the state, to help us predict where they might be, or to predict how big they are, where we might find them, that sort of thing. Because sometimes, like I said, they're not recorded. So to predict where they are, looking at examples will help us narrow down, sort of triangulate. We often act as a secondary repository for citizen knowledge. So they'll have their copy and they'll send us copies of their genealogy or their photos or their research, so that we have a backup copy in case something happens to their research, a storm or fire or something along those lines. We also, my office handles a lot of environmental review, so permits attached to large scale projects or projects that use federal money or state money, or on federal or state land. And so sometimes we'll hear about a DOT project that's happening 10 years before the ordinary citizens might hear about it. So we can give the DOT or whoever a heads up that there's a cemetery there, so that they develop plans ahead. We don't like 11th hour finds of cemeteries. We also share when there is opportunities for research or grants or things like that. Cemetery grants are very, very, very rare. They're sort of a hot potato type of resource. And so that is something that when we do have an opportunity pop up, that I look at my list and send out information to people who might be eligible for those resources. Again, also, we help develop management planning and disaster preparedness, help people. We were in Asheville a few weeks ago, helping with a post-Helene cemetery restoration workshop to help people who manage or have family cemeteries come up with a plan to help fix or mitigate damage that happened during the storms. So what cemeteries qualify for addition? It could be any cemetery. It doesn't matter if it's on public or private land, if it's little or big, if it's active or inactive. The biggest thing that it has to meet is that federal definition of historic, which is 50 years. So if your cemetery existed when Monty Python and the Holy Grail was in the movie theaters, it can be added to the state registry. Eventually all will, but right now we have to take those that are 50 years or older. Now this is the first page of the citizen form. We do recognize that not everyone knows all things about the cemetery that they are reporting to us. Sometimes it's a family cemetery and they know everything. They know everything. Sometimes it's a cemetery that they drive by every day, or when they walk the trails, that's a cemetery they see. And so we have lots of options that you can check or fill out on this form. However, if you don't know the information, there are some important things that are really important for us to include, and everything else we can fill out now. If we find information in the future, we can add additional information. It's a living document. It can be added and fixed and amended and at any time. So the biggest thing is the location. Because many cemeteries, if you're not aware, a lot of cemeteries change names over time. Sometimes it's something the family decides or the church decides. Sometimes there's an outsider reporting a cemetery and say it is the Smith family cemetery, but all the Smiths had wooden crosses that don't exist anymore. And the only stone marker has Johnson. And Johnson was a little boy that lived was a neighbor. But because the only surviving headstone says Johnson, now the cemetery is known as the Johnson family cemetery. And so one thing that doesn't change with cemeteries is their location. They don't pick up and move. And so if you have a preferred name or know of all of the names that a cemetery is known by, we'd love to have it, especially if you feel very strongly in your family member. However, the location is the most important thing. Now, most people don't have a high-tech GPS unit, but you can get pretty good coordinates, as you can see to put along the bottom there, through some publicly available sources like Google Earth and Google Maps. It's fairly simple. If you're in Google Earth and you hover your cursor over the cemetery, the coordinates will pop up in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. If you are in Google Maps and you hover your cursor over the cemetery and right-click, the drop-down box that appears will have the coordinates as the first line. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need something high-tech. We also provide a space for recorder information so that if you have want to be contacted about if you hear a DOT project is happening or something like that, then you have a space for us to more quickly contact you in a more expedient fashion to address concerns. Now, I do say that we have these, and the map isn't publicly accessible. These forms aren't either. So that might give, especially if you're talking to a landowner who feels uncomfortable about sharing information, some comfort, because when we do disseminate, we do give out these forms. If people request them, we often do redactions that might include contacting information, so they don't have to worry about people trespassing or reaching out to them if they don't want to. Another aside about Google Maps is they are great for helping you understand the cemetery too, because a lot of times we don't see bird's eye views of the cemetery. And this is a cemetery near where I live. It's a church cemetery. And if you can look into the cemetery and see all those dark horizontal dashes, those are all grave shafts, because when a grave is dug, that sort of churned up dirt often holds water in a different way than the dirt that surrounds it. So water pools there and the grass is often greener. Now, if you're standing in that cemetery, like the arrows point to where I took these pictures from, you can't see these dark green patches. So having this aerial image is very helpful for me to understand just how many people might be buried in the cemetery. Now, my train dies when I stood on the opposite end of the cemetery. I was able to see some of these dark marks, as you can see, circled. However, that is something that I've learned through my sort of training and visiting many cemeteries across the state for years and years and years. So having these images for people who have no background can be very useful for you to understand who exactly and how many people might be there. Our next pages talk all about the different characteristics of the cemetery. So things you may or may not know. Is it owned? Was it a public cemetery owned by a city or a county or a federal government? Was it a private cemetery owned by a church or a family? Or there are lots of fraternal organizations, people like the IOOF. They have their own cemeteries, that sort of thing. Is it? I have no clue, not a single clue who these folks are. And sometimes it is very hard to tell, especially, for example, like the cemetery in the lower image on the right-hand side that is associated with an enslaved community. And it's very difficult, if you aren't aware of fieldstone markers, to tell who is buried in that cemetery. So I would check the unknown or abandoned. You can talk about how well maintained it is, how many graves you know or think there are, the dates that you're seeing, if it's 18th or 19th or 20th century. You can talk about, are the graves only marked with formal markers, even broken ones like you see in the top left and top right hand side, or are they marked with just plain uninscribed fieldstones or artifacts, or just their grave depressions where the grave has sunk over time. This is where we also recommend that people take lots of pictures, things like the headstones, even the broken pieces. But don't forget, too, to take pictures of the whole cemetery. Whole cemetery pictures are incredibly useful, not only for understanding how headstones are related to each other, where they are in relation to the headstones around them, to the trees, to the fence, to the no fence, but they're also very useful in case something happens. Say there's lots of stories of people taking a sharp bend in the road too fast and their car ends up in the cemetery, or if there's vandalism, or if there's a storm. Having these whole cemetery pictures will prove that those trees fell during the storm and not before, which may open up the possibility of storm relief money. So use this as both a reporting of the cemetery, but also as a permanent record of this cemetery's story. We also ask about artifacts. Now, artifacts are anything that is made, the definition is anything made or used by human beings, but in cemeteries, they often are used, they're often used by communities, different communities in different ways. For example, along the coast up through Jacksonville, there is an extension of the Gullah Geechee corridor, which is an African-American community where the use of shells and artifacts, personal artifacts, vessels that contain water, things in the color of blue and white, are used at the graveside because they harken back to Central and West African religious and cultural traditions that even the participants might not believe in, but it's what we've always done. And so those traditions continue. We also see things like we see religious items, angel statues, military dog tags or compasses, or things like alcohol bottles left on the graveside that are specifically there because they are part of a memorial. They're part of a tradition. Those things too, if you didn't know, because they are acting in the capacity of memorial, they are also protected in the same way under the North Carolina statutes as the headstones. This also goes for plants. There are a lot of ceremonial plants, a lot of favorite plants. Your mother was fond of roses or daffodils. These things, as well as cultural items like periwinkle or yucca, those things are, because they are often the only surviving, the only thing marking a grave, they are treated in the same way as a headstone, and so they are protected by the North Carolina statutes. Now, if you're doing something like a recording project as part of a broader cleanup and a restoration effort, and you are nervous now about, is this ceremonial or is this garbage? Let me know before your cleanup happens, and I will give you my work cell phone number, and you can text me pictures. So that way I can help you go, that Mountain Dew bottle can probably go, or that shell probably should stay. We also provide a place where you can talk about, are there any threats? That way we can keep a ongoing record if these threats change, and any historical significance. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that your cemetery is where George Washington is buried. There could be other importance, like this was a Scottish, people of Scottish heritage. This was a cemetery where people were sort of founders of the community, or they were champion bakers, or anything that tells us about the community that used and are buried in this cemetery is helpful for us to create a picture, not only of this particular place, but places around it, so we can compare and contrast, so that when we come across a cemetery that has unknown origin, we can use the evidence of all the cemeteries around it to best predict what this particular cemetery might be. And so we welcome lots of other information as well. And that includes deeds, plats, land records, family stories, photos of people that are buried there, death certificates. I have a collection of photos that were taken often in the 70s and 80s of family cleanup days, where there are pictures of children standing very uncomfortably next to headstones, wondering what they're doing there. I love them because they are incredibly awkward family photos, but also they're incredibly useful, because while we do have something like 35,000 cemeteries on the state registry, many of the cemeteries were added back in the 70s and 80s. There's a big push around the bicentennial to record cemeteries. And so a cemetery, while I'm thrilled that we have a place marker on our map and an old form that has some information, although the old forms didn't contain a whole lot of great information, a 1976 cemetery and the 2025 version of the cemetery may be two completely different things. Wooden markers may have gone away. There may have been impact from tree falls or development or road widening project. And so we love also to have updates. We call them revisits to the same cemetery so that we can keep track every few years, every 5 years, every 10 years, however many, how often we can, of how this cemetery is changing. Because that's the other thing, especially for management planning, is a lot of times we're so close to the picture that we can't see the changes that are happening. We can't tell unless we are keeping really good records over time that the creek that runs along the backside of the cemetery has shifted over time. And now we've got some drainage issues in the back left-hand corner. But it's hard to do that without keeping records over time. So that's part of that management planning that I talk to people about. We do provide you with a page that can be used to add an inventory of people that are buried there. Not all people choose to do that, but if you have an already established inventory in an Excel spreadsheet, in a Microsoft Word, we don't reinvent the wheel. You can send that to me in another as an attachment. This is for people who are sort of starting from scratch. So inventorying a cemetery briefly is a fantastic project that you can do, especially to develop or utilize community buy-in, because it's relatively simple to do. And it's all about sort of breaking things into manageable chunks, because that's what all of this is. It's a whole cemetery preservation game. I talk to people about breaking the very big and rather intimidating prospect into manageable chunks. And for cemetery inventories, that would be so dividing the cemetery up into sections, especially if it's a very big cemetery or like a church cemetery. And then having teams rather than individual people use standardized paperwork, maybe one that you created yourself or one that you borrowed. I can send you lots of examples of paperwork that's out there that you can utilize and make more appropriate for your particular cemetery, so that everyone's doing the exact same thing and that you have a place for them to write their names down. So if there are questions, you can go to them. Using standardized keys and how to record lines and record words. For example, a big thing in recording cemetery transcriptions is to not presume. Do not correct spelling. Don't presume that this is what it says, that this is the date, even if you know the date, because oftentimes that information is there for a reason. Sometimes it's because people didn't read or write very well, but even then, my favorite thing to think about with misspellings is that oftentimes when people can't spell very well, they spell things out phonetically, how they hear them. So misspellings can be equated to that person's accents. You're almost hearing their voice in the way that they spelled out that word. But also, we've all done genealogy information where census records or official documents have just butchered a relative's name. And so writing exactly what you see as you see it, with even if the punctuation seems wrong, even if the spelling seems wrong, is very important. Also recording, if you're including this as part of a widening mapping effort, because this can go in hand, make sure you don't just record where there are legible markers, because just because a grave no longer has a headstone doesn't mean that the stuff under the ground is gone. I always tell people that what's on the surface in a cemetery very, 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 very rarely matches what's underneath, even in a modern cemetery. A lot of them don't have headstones yet, or families who can't afford headstones, or the headstones were made of a material that doesn't survive, like a wooden marker. And so we need to make sure that we record all features, depressions, broken pieces, artifacts, plants, fences, trees, so that we have a good starting point of where we think everything is. Then that can be very helpful if there's a storm, if there's vandalism, if we look and see that all of the broken pieces are on the west-hand side of the story. Maybe when we report this information to the police, we can have them patrol that western side of the cemetery, drive up that way to make sure there's no hooliganism happening. It's also good to have checks and balances when doing a cemetery inventory and cemetery recording, having each team not only be more than one person and be taking, say, lots of pictures of the headstone, of the footstone, of the whole grave together, but also having organizers double check the paperwork before they say, okay, that section's good and done, you can move on to the next section. When you have your maps and your inventories recorded, have a safe communal place to put it, especially if you're working with something like a church or a family where there's lots of people that come and go or who are volunteers. Having something like a general cloud access or a database kept at a public location or a common location is really important, because what happens, especially in places like churches that rely very heavily on ministries or volunteers, is that, you know, Miss Betty takes the paperwork home to type it up, and then Miss Betty has a health scare and has to be transported somewhere else, and then 10 years later her kids are going through her stuff and go, what the heck is this? And then they throw all those documents away, and then that information is gone forever. So having them stored in a safe central location is important, and sending a copy to us at the state so that we also have a copy in case something happens. And then again, if you run into trouble, make sure you reach out to us, because I'm very happy to send so many resources that'll spin your head, as well as give you advice for your particular situation that I've seen other people do, or that have not worked for other people, to help you along in the process. This I like to show you as I'm sort of wrapping things up is one of the best cemetery mapping projects I've ever received since I've worked here. And this work was 100% done by an Eagle Scout. Eagle Scouts are great help for cemeteries. They do lots of building projects, lots of cleanup projects. But this Eagle Scout over in Burke County, he wanted to do a mapping project. So as you can see, he divided the cemetery up into a grid, and then he created his own paperwork that had which section the individual sheet was from, who worked on it. He trained his team, he had symbols, and when the map was completed, it was so good that you could take all the individual forms, line them up next to each other, and they all overlapped. I taught archaeology college students something called a field school, where we go into an archaeology site and teach them how to physically dig. And this Eagle Scouts maps were way better than some of even my archaeology students, who I always struggle to get their maps to line up. So this was a fantastic resource for the Obeth Cemetery, done by an Eagle Scout. Now, if you have questions, or you are looking for information, or to see if a cemetery is on the state registry, here is my contact information. I will put it in the chat below. I also, you can see at the bottom, have listed the cemetery program that has the forms, but I can also, it's a fillable PDF, but if you are more comfortable with a Microsoft Word version, I can send you that. Or if you have none of the above, and you would prefer a printout version, I can mail one to you. Once the forms are completed, you either mail or email them back to me, and I will put them into the system and then send you back a file number for your records. That way, in the future, if you would like to add additional information, you found a new resource, a tree fell over, and you want to update the form about the damage and the recovery, all you have to do is provide me with the file number and say, this new photo or this new record goes in this file. Many cemeteries have very similar names. There's so many oak lawns, oak wood, forest lawn. And so, especially for bigger cemeteries, I like to make sure we include the file number because I want to make sure that this new information gets to the right place. So definitely recommend reaching out if you need to, and checking out our resources on our website, which include the laws, additional webinars, additional state resources, and this new state library cemetery research guide will also be on our website when it goes live, as well as this webinar. So thank you so much for having me today. If we have questions, I am happy to take them.
Thank you, Melissa. That was wonderful. We did have some questions and comments come in through the chat while you were presenting. In the meantime, while I'm sifting through some of those, if anybody else has questions for Melissa today, feel free to drop those in the chat, and hopefully we will be able to get to all of the wonderful questions today. So the first question in the chat from Melissa is, are all developers required to check with state archaeology to see if there is a cemetery in their proposed development plan, or is it just developers that are doing the state work?
It depends. Because all cemeteries are protected by law, it is a very good idea to do so, to check that, or to check the county list or the county knowledge, because impacting a cemetery can be a felony or a misdemeanor charge, misdemeanors all the way up to a class H or class I felony. So it is a good idea regardless. And there are a number of counties that are also beginning to consider local ordinances that require adding and looking for cemeteries on their properties before sales or after sales or what have you. So that's one thing that we're sort of working on that's not required in the state law. A lot of cemeteries especially, for example, in subdivision developments, what often happens is they create, because moving a cemetery can be a very expensive endeavor, so most choose to leave them alone, and they'll create a weird little green space island. They'll call it a green space, and that's essentially a cemetery, because many subdivisions are going on to old farms, and a lot of old farms have cemeteries. So it is something that we strongly recommend to get ahead of trouble, because unlike some of the things with archaeology sites, there are, under the criminal code, very negative consequences that can happen if they don't investigate. Now, there are bad actors everywhere that we work on, but it is something that we definitely strongly recommend.
Thank you. There is also a page on the archaeology website that provides a brief overview of North Carolina cemetery laws, if anyone is interested in access to and preservation of your local cemeteries. I'm going to skip around a bit because we have a question that's related to the one you just answered, Melissa. So this is a really great question. Who technically enforces the cemetery state laws? Is it the local sheriff's offices or other groups?
The way the laws are written, because they're under the criminal code, it's either local law enforcement or the county sheriffs. Now, this is a weird part of the criminal code that a lot of the local law enforcement is not super familiar with. So I often tell people, if they are writing a violation or contacting law enforcement about the violation, to cite the specific statutes that they have broken, because that'll help them understand that, because a lot of them presume that this is a civil matter, but it is not. It is a criminal matter, so they are the ones who handle violations.
Thank you. Okay. And then the next question we have in the chat from earlier, somebody put in the chat that they have a family cemetery around 75 to 100 years old in the state that is now no longer owned by the family. What protections does that cemetery have now to prevent it from being destroyed by development?
All cemeteries are protected regardless of who owns them. in North Carolina, the way it shakes out is whoever owns the property on which a cemetery stands, they own the cemetery. However, they don't own the graves. They don't own the actual human remains or the headstones or the artifacts. Those are the ownership of the estate of that person. And so it doesn't matter if your family doesn't own that property or not. It's still protected. I do recommend that if you know of a cemetery on a piece of property that your family doesn't own anymore, maybe it's a big old farm, I would recommend getting that, making sure that that's recorded so that you've got extra eyes and a contact information so that if something does happen, that there is a person they can reach out to instead of going like, well, we tried. We want to make sure that you as a family member get to hear about something that if it's going to negatively impact, for example, if graves get moved under North Carolina General Statute 65106, one of the things that is required is to put out a public notification because the descendants have a role in deciding where those people might be relocated. And so we want to be able to catch the people who can make those decisions so that they aren't being made without them.
Thank you. We have a comment I'd like to share because I think it's really fun. Somebody has commented in the chat in regards to the Eagle Scout Cemetery project that you mentioned, Melissa, that is their son, and they were in attendance today.
Yeah, he was so great. He was great to work with.
That is excellent. We love to see citizen surveying of cemeteries. So another question is, how does a cemetery get the status of a North Carolina historic cemetery?
Any cemetery in North Carolina that is at least 50 years old is considered historic. Now, there are two different historics, I say. There's a lower H historic, which means that it meets that 50-year-old definition. And then there's capital H historic, which is National Register for Historic Places. When you talk to historic preservation professionals, they hear capital H, but any cemetery that meets that 50 years is historic. Now, it's very, very, very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to get a cemetery on the National Register. A lot of people go for, especially for humble cemeteries associated with families or communities or churches, that don't have like the grand monumentation, the big marble mausoleums or that sort of thing. They often say, well, there's an important person here. However, the DC National Register staff has said that if that important person's house or their church where they were a pastor at or their school is still standing, they'd rather you nominate the standing structure than the cemetery, because there's this assumption that the cemetery is already historic. Now, it's not impossible. So there's lots of cemeteries that have been added for the last couple of years in North Carolina, but it is incredibly difficult, and it's a 2 to 3 year process. By the time research and review and that sort of thing, we can connect you with a National Register staff at the State Historic Preservation Office if you are interested. But as far as just being, this is an old cemetery and it's going to go on the state registry, 50 years.
All righty, excellent. There's another question, Melissa, I would love to personally hear your thoughts on, if you have some insight into this. The question is, how helpful are the Find a Grave websites? And I can speak to this a little bit in my experience doing reference work at in the reading room at the Government Heritage Library. But I guess related to this question, if I can add on to it, is what is recorded as the birth and death dates on a tombstone usually the most accurate source of information? Or would you suggest looking at other records to verify the information that was reported and inscribed on a tombstone?
Yeah, I tell people that Find a Grave is kind of like Wikipedia. It's a really, really good starting point, especially if they have coordinates or things like that, because it is 100% citizen sourced information. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but Find a Grave high volume submitters have a lot of like territorial beef and they go for quantity over quality. So we see a lot of misplaced individuals in wrong cemeteries, incorrect information, proprietariness over cemeteries that they're not associated with, which means that families can't even go in to correct them because they've sort of locked it in their own little corner. And so it's a really great place to start. However, much like every other type of research, whether that be historical or genealogical or archaeological, you don't judge what the whole puzzle is by one puzzle piece. Take into account many different sources because we don't know who commissioned that headstone. If it was commissioned much later, if it was commissioned by, I have a relative who had Alzheimer's, who in the early mid stages commissioned his headstone, and the information's a little off because of his diagnosis. It may have been done by a friend or a neighbor. We see that often in especially historic situations when there are populations that are just starting out or transient populations. And so the information might be off. However, like I said, if you're recording a cemetery, even if you know for a fact that they were not buried, that they were not born in 1919, they were born in 1907, write down what you're seeing so that you have a pretty accurate accounting. That way, you've got one more thing to type into Ancestry or into the search because you know it's 1919 or 1917, but it also may have been recorded improperly in other locations, which may lead you to other documents that you didn't know existed because a perpetuation of incorrect information. So broadening your search terms, even if you know the search terms are incorrect, because we remember all the things we're talking about are decisions made by human beings, and human beings have never been perfect, especially in the case of recording stuff. And so definitely look at things like Find a Grave with a grain of salt.
Exactly. And that is what we tell researchers as well. I recently was assisting a researcher in our reading room, looking into the birth and death dates of an ancestor. Find a Grave said the birth date of this person, or the birth year of this person, was 1885. We found multiple other records that indicated the birth year was 1888. It turns out that through multiple different searches, the death certificate was improper. The birth year was improperly recorded for this person as 1888. The family submitted the information for the tombstone, and the correct birth year was 1885. So always, like Melissa said, do some further digging and realize that these records, whether they're tombstones or artifacts or paper documents, are recorded by whomever, and they are, it is
Especially,
possible that
yeah, if
there's
it's based
discrepancies.
on death certificates, sometimes it was a family member, but if they were passed away far away from home or in a hospital, who knows? Who knows? It's kind of like the census
Yes.
records. They're always a mixed bag of what the heck is this?
Yes, and that is exactly what happened. The person passed in a state that they had no existing close relatives. So I think that's an excellent example of the research process and the joys of doing genealogical research, the trials and tribulations, if you will. So we have another really great question. If a small family cemetery is now owned by somebody else, can the new landowners or property owners prohibit further burials of direct descendants in that cemetery?
Yes, because there is a reasonable right of access statute in North Carolina. It's General Statute 65101 with landowner permission, and then General Statute 65102 without landowner permission. However, those tasks outlined as permissible are to discover, restore, maintain, or visit. It does not say anything about burials. So if you are interested in burying in a family cemetery, and I know this is coming up because I get a lot more calls now that genealogy is so much more publicly accessible. People go, I want to be buried next to my great grandmother or what have you. My great grandfather was a Revolutionary War general, and so I want to be buried next to him. And that's happening because people have access to cemeteries that have not had visitors in a century are seeing visitors strictly because of DNA testing and ancestry and genealogy popularity. However, it is privately owned property. And so you need to talk to the landowner. Some people might be okay with it allowing extra burials, but then you also have to follow up with the local community, the municipality, or the county to see what kind of burial ordinances exist. Some have them, some don't. Some are very restrictive. And so but legally, they do not have to allow you to bury there anymore. It's at their discretion because they are the landowners. And so that's why I recommend to people to have transparent conversations with the landowners, but also if your family is looking at selling the property, you can't keep the farm anymore or what have you, make sure, please, that you out parcel, put the cemetery on its own tax parcel, and then create a formal easement, whether that is a wording agreement or a little stem of land from the cemetery to the nearest road. That way you don't have to ask for permission to cross over property or to access property or to do whatever you want on the property because there is no other owner attached to it. And most counties too, if you get that new parcel rezoned as a cemetery, it's no longer up for property taxes. It's tax exempt. But that is the only way you can ensure that your family has unfettered access to all decision making. Well,
I'm muted. Sorry. There was some noise outside on the street. This is an interesting question, and I think a lot of us are also thinking critically about this in state government and in our various disciplines and fields. But what effect do you think artificial intelligence will have on your work with cemeteries and cemetery preservation?
Mixed bag. I think that what it will be good for is creating models to help us predict where we'll find cemeteries, because most cemeteries in North Carolina, whether they be, well, I guess most, have predictable patterns of where you might expect to find them. So that's based on community type, time period, land formations, historical land use. And we already sort of do that by hand as archaeologists and researchers to say, okay, this was a plantation, so this is where we might expect to find the white folks cemetery. This is where we might expect to find the enslaved community cemetery. This is where we might expect to find the post-emancipation sharecropper cemetery. So I can see that being very helpful for pattern recognition, for helping us understand where to find them to better predict where they are, because some are just lost to time. There's no people to talk about them anymore. Beyond that, there is some interesting research with like biology to help us potentially do DNA testing to identify graves. Because right now we've got things like GPR that can help identify potential graves, but unless you open up the grave, which is strongly not recommended by my office, and doing DNA testing, there's no way to identify who is in that grave. Well, you just might be able to say it's an adult versus a child. But as far as AI, I see the biggest thing and what will be the most helpful are predictive models, which will be invaluable, especially with how fast North Carolina is developing. So many cemeteries were previously protected by camouflage are not anymore. And we definitely want to find these and protect them ahead of time so that we don't have to call in the cops. We don't have to call in, traumatize a whole bunch of people when we could have just found it ahead of time. And sometimes walking through the brush on foot, even with super trained archaeological professionals, because the brush is so high or so dense. You can miss a fieldstone cemetery just because the environment visually isn't very conducive to finding things out. So that's where I'm hoping it will be the most likely to help us out. A lot of it, though, is the cultural stuff. Also, seeing the potentially comparing land ownership and cemetery to help us sort of reverse guess who's potentially buried in there. But I think that's where it's probably going to go fairly soon, because we're seeing some projects start to develop that way.
Well, thank you, Melissa. That puts us at time today. We did not get to address all of the questions you posted in the chat today, but I will be following up with everybody who registered for this webinar to provide additional resources, links, and Melissa's contact information. Should you have any specific questions about the state's historic cemeteries or historic cemetery preservation, you can reach out to Melissa. Quick reminder, this webinar is going to be recorded and posted on the State Library YouTube channel, and we will provide those additional resources in a follow-up email very shortly. I'd like to thank Melissa from State Archaeology Office for this wonderful presentation, and keep your eyes peeled for any future webinars we will be hosting as a part of the State Library Government Heritage Library. Thank you all so much.